Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. And thank you so much for joining us from across the globe. As I understand it, we have somewhere between 300 and 400 participants dialing in various countries across various time zones. And we're certainly very glad to have you here. I myself am, I suppose, adding to the geographical diversity by dialing in from Banjul, the Gambia. My name is Shola Mahoney. I sit on the advisory board of PARC and very pleased to be here today, and I will be your moderator. Just a little bit of housekeeping to get started. For those of you, when I say welcome, I should also have said bienvenue and benvindo. But for our Francophone and our Lusophone speakers, please go to the Zoom chat box and you'll get instructions there as to how to connect to the relevant channel. The format of today's event is essentially built around 3 panel discussions around some specific themes that fall very much in line with the raison d'etre of PARC and what PARC is trying to do and trying to achieve. And just so you know, we will have 3 panels with different panelists speaking on those questions. I want to assure you also that what we are saying today, today's event is being recorded for future use and sharing so that you will be able to access it, we'll be able to access it at a later date. We are also using Slido, and I believe the instructions and explanation on how to use Slido will be in the chat box. And if you follow the instructions, you'll understand fairly clearly how it will work, but it will allow you to submit questions even before or as the presenters are sharing their reflections, and those will somehow find their way to me. I should also say that this event, aside from being recorded, it's being live tweeted, I think, behind the hashtag #ParkLaunch. And all the materials that you will be seeing today, including the videos, will be available on the website after the launch. We will also encourage you to, this is all about establishing a community of stakeholders, those who are particularly interested and involved in the topics that we will be dealing with today and involved with the work that PARC is trying to get done, and those who are interested in our vision. So we will be encouraging you to join our community, and there will be instructions placed in the chat box in due course that will allow you to do that, because we want this to be a conversation, an ongoing conversation. And so somewhere in the portal on the website, we will find a way of accommodating and encouraging the conversation, sharing your thinking with us, and we will welcome blogs, blog posts, and other reflections that you may want to share with us after the event. So I think that more or less concludes the housekeeping for today's event. And now that's sorted, let me, as a member of the PARC Advisory Board, welcome you once again and just say what a great pleasure it really is to have so many of you dialing in, and really do appreciate your presence. As I've said, my name is Shola Mahoney. I come to the PARC board via an interesting route, but let's just say that for the past 20 years, and I'm still very much in that mode, I am in the private sector. And as someone from the private sector, without the same connections, I believe, as many of you, my connections with academia are slightly different. And so you might be wondering what it is that drew me to PARC. And I would say that it's ambitious, the ambitious vision that PARC has to fix something that wasn't right, to rebalance, recalibrate something that was not right in our world, something that was unevenly balanced. And that was perhaps one of those things that was just out of kilter, if I can use that term. And having worked for the past 20 years of my banking career in various countries across Africa, always working for a bank from the global north, And it was a situation where you can imagine, as bankers in Africa, we were essentially following the dictates from the global headquarters in the global north. So you can perhaps understand why the inequities in the world of academia, particularly the imbalances in the academic collaborations between institutions in the global north and institutions in Africa, you can understand that when I encountered those, they looked very much like a familiar movie. In fact, one that I had seen several times and actually lived through my past experience as a banker working for a bank in the global north. And I felt that at that time, you couldn't do anything about it. It was just, that's just the way it is in the private sector, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and things fall in line with wherever the decision maker is sitting. But when I was invited specifically to join the advisory board, one of the reasons why I immediately accepted was because I saw this as an opportunity to help correct and redress or remedy something that was wrong, something that was inherently inequitable about the current way of doing things and dealing with things that were, after all, fundamentally African. And aside from the fact that I firmly believe in PARC's mission, which is to champion the transformation in research and partnership and to advance, thereby advancing Africa's achievement of its own aspirations, as an African, I do feel that there is something truly unique about this opportunity, because in a sharp departure from the way things used to be, certainly in my previous life when I was an international banker, this is a truly privileged opportunity for me, certainly, to work from the vantage point of the global north and see to it that we do genuinely and constructively reach out to Africa and its institutions and work together to rebalance things. And I must say how wonderfully serendipitous it is that all this is happening under the leadership and under the auspices of the University of Bristol, which has already carved out for itself a very special place in history as a champion of similar initiatives. And all this to be happening at a time when the world's conscience seems to be experiencing a timely and dare I say, much needed reawakening from its slumber. So against that background and with that framing in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Judith Squires, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Bristol, to say a few words. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you very much. I'm Judith Squires, and I am the Provost and Deputy Vice Chancellor here at the University of Bristol. And I also chair the Management Board for the Perivoli Africa Research Centre. And it's a genuine honour to be welcoming you here to this launch event. This centre was funded by a generous donation from the Perivoli Trust, which has a long-standing philanthropic focus on Africa. And the generous £1 million that we were given by the Perivoli Trust made it possible for us to create new roles and new opportunities for Bristol researchers to tackle key challenges and pioneer innovative solutions for the most pressing concerns on the continent. This gift represented the Trust's and the University's shared ambition to strive for innovative approaches to achieve impactful change that will benefit generations for years to come in Africa. So what have we done so far? Well, we have established, and we're launching today, the new Centre for Africa Research and Partnerships that was established to achieve real and impactful change in the areas of research, education, health, well-being, sustainable agriculture, resilience and governance, and migration and mobility. We've appointed a Perivoli Chair of Africa Research and Partnerships, Professor Isabella Obodoran, who you're going to hear from in a moment. And she's been appointed to develop and expand our portfolio of interdisciplinary research in partnerships with universities, international agencies, charities, governments and organisations across Africa. We were really delighted to appoint Isabella, who actually returned to us, having done both her undergraduate and doctoral studies here at Bristol. And she was able to take up her chair, having also been a senior research scientist and head of Aging and Development Unit at the African Population and Health Research Centre in Nairobi. So for us, absolutely stellar appointment, and we're really delighted to have her as the inaugural director of PARC. We've also appointed a range of roles for the Centre, including Vice-Chancellor Fellow and PhD Scholars. And these appointments will ensure that the Centre is able to further develop the interdisciplinary research and initiatives that are responsive to and help to advance Africa's population and development and innovation agendas. And we hope to deepen collaboration between the university, African research policy, civil society and private sector bodies. So what are we aiming to do? Well, we're really seeking to add value to and build upon our university's existing broad portfolio of African-oriented research, and to offer a community and a platform for exchange for all of those engaged or interested in such work, both in the university, in our city of Bristol and around the globe. We're aiming really to become a hub for forward-looking, respectful, UK-Africa cooperation in research and learning, and by doing so foster fresh critical thinking on necessary frames and approaches to UK-Africa partnerships, and produce knowledge on and for the continent, bringing together existing clusters of interdisciplinary expertise across the university. And as has already been mentioned, we're really hoping that we will forge new partnerships with African and international institutions and networks as part of our work. And also finally, I would emphasize that we're really keen to expand student and staff exchanges in order to support those endeavours. So let me just conclude by saying we are really proud at the University of Bristol to support PARC's mission and to champion the transformation in Africa research and partnerships, which we hope will help advance a broader shift in the global research ecosystem that sees African institutions and interests take their rightful place in knowledge production. This centre represents for us a really key part of our wide-ranging work to tackle and challenge decolonisation. So I'm going to hand over now to the Director of the Perivalley Africa Research Centre, Professor Isabella Aboudran. Isabella.
Thank you very much, Judith, and welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Shala. So my name is Isabella Aboudran. I have the privilege of directing PARC. And first of all, I'm very delighted to introduce the PARC team to you. So we have on the screen, you can see we have Dr. Susan Jim, Dr. Robert Crow, Dr. Elliot James, and as Judith alluded to, we are going to be we're going to be joined in a few months by Dr. Ayob Gebremariam and Dr. Francis Zananab, as well as Hilda Owi, who will be a PhD student with us. So in introducing PARC, the centre, I must begin with the personal, and this includes my dual African-European heritage, which has always implied a need to forge connections between Africa and the global north, and yes, negotiate interests between them. But it positions me too very firmly as part of Africa's diaspora. Before joining the University of Bristol, as Judith mentioned, I spent 8 years at the African Population and Health Research Centre, or APHRC, in Nairobi, an institution that seeks explicitly to raise the voice of Africa in the research system, and that advocates the need for African institutions, terms and interests to take their rightful place in that system as a key factor in the continent's ability to flourish and to achieve its own aspirations. So when I learned about the University of Bristol opportunity and the generous gift given to the university, my first reaction was a question. If this gift was aimed ultimately to benefit Africa through research, why was it given to an institute in the global north? Why not to an institution in the continent? But this gave way to a recognition that universities in the global north, as key actors, as key agents in the global research system, and as collaborators of Africa, must play a part, have a responsibility to play a part in changing the system, to ensure that Africa does take its rightful place in research and in the production of knowledge. Knowledge in and for the continent, yes, but also, and this is very important, knowledge on the workings of the world broadly. And then there was another recognition, and I know Bristol because I studied there. There was a recognition that Bristol, both the university and the city, with its culture of social responsibility, alternative thinking, and yes, activism, and its serious engagement now with its own uncomfortable colonial history, including through the work of my colleague, Olivette Otele, and its serious work on tackling the challenge of decolonization, that Bristol is particularly positioned to play a part in championing a shift in the research system, specifically through a transformation in how it does and how perhaps others will do research and partnerships with Africa. And it is with this perspective that I joined the university and that I'm so excited to be leading PARC in its inaugural few years. We have a strong feeling, not least in light of the intensifying debate, some of you will be part of that, on equitable partnerships, on decolonization, on broader funding modes for science and development in Africa. We have a strong feeling that this is the right moment for our endeavor. And with that, I'm very pleased to unveil a short animated film, which was developed by a PARC partner in Nairobi to lay out our basic mission and approach as a way to formally open the discussion segment of this event. Thank you. I think the audio wasn't working on that. Maybe we'll try again.
A region's ability to nurture strong research institutions and evidence generation can pay off in a multitude of ways. It can spur innovation in enterprise and positive change in policy making and service provision. It delivers prestige and influence in global debates, critical factors for protecting national and regional interests and shaping world affairs. Much research is undertaken in and for Africa. It is often, however, done together with and frequently driven by institutions in the global north. Power imbalances in such collaborations are common. These legacies of colonialism have undermined the strength of African research institutions and the relevance and use of generated evidence. They have limited Africa's ability to reap the full benefits of research. Africa's future demands a shift in the global research system, a shift that sees African constituencies and interests take their rightful place in knowledge production. This is the core challenge that we at the University of Bristol Perivoli Africa Research Centre seek to address. Our starting point is in centering Africa's own vision for its future, the continent's Agenda 2063. The agenda emphasizes Africa's aspiration not only for social and economic progress, but to be a strong global partner. It calls for rebalancing of Africa's partnerships and for international actors to play their part. PARC is working to envision, model, and champion a rebalanced mode of doing research with Africa. First, we seek to bring together existing voices, foster inquiry, and provide thought leadership on new approaches. Second, we seek to apply such approaches in practice in capstone research programs that are regional in scope and intend to yield action and change. Third, we seek to promote mutual capacity strengthening to embed new ways for the next generation of scholars to conduct global North Africa research. Across all, we seek to nurture a global community of interest to catalyze and offer a forum for raising questions and finding answers. We look forward to engaging you and your forward thinking in our work.
Thank you very much, Isabella, for that introduction, and thank you for sharing that video. And that's a video many of you will realize I've seen a few times, and each time I see it, one of the things that comes to mind is the number of moving parts in the first few frames. And for me, that's very much a metaphor, as it were, for the complexity of Africa. So many different countries, different cultures, and then you add to that the number of different interest groups, those who are well-wishers who are looking to work with Africa. And so the question that comes to mind, I think, for many of us is, with PARC, how do you go about getting everybody to coalesce around one single vision? And one of the decisions that PARC has had to make, it has been to inform its own approach. What are they going to use? And they have taken the decision to ground their commitment and all inquiry into Africa's own Agenda 2063. Our first panel is here to discuss why that particular frame of reference has been selected. But before we do that, we would like to play for you a video in which you hear from other experts in the field to get their view and some of their reflections on this very important theme. Could we have the video, please?
Agenda 2063 addresses our continental vision, which is to build an integrated and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the international arena.
You speak to any government on the continent and they will refer you to Agenda 2063.
Investing African money into African problems to find African solutions should be something we should aspire to and indeed campaign and promote.
It's good that Africans are controlling a conversation around their priorities and how they contextualize things.
There are things happening already, and mapping and researching those and supporting them, that would go a long way to address some of these imbalances.
When you don't own the resources and you don't own an outcome of a process, it becomes very difficult for you to use those outcomes for development efforts and initiatives. And linked to that,
I'm excited that PARC recognizes the importance of Agenda 2063.
Thank you very much indeed. And now I present and bring back on screen Professor Isabella Aboderin, who is going to be discussing this theme with our distinguished panel of experts. And for this particular panel, we have Dr. Samia Chasi, the Strategic Advisor of the International Education Association of South Africa, Dr. Zuba Wai, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and Center for Critical Development Studies. Oh, sorry, something went wrong here. I do beg your pardon. This always happens, a slight technical glitch on my side. Sorry. Finally, and Mr. Oumar Diop, the Senior Policy Officer from the Department of Social Affairs at the African Union Commission. And in terms of how we are set up, each panelist has prepared a short statement to begin with on the question, the specific question, why it is important for PARC to align its intentions to the Africa Union's Agenda 2063, when everyone else seems to be focusing on the UN's development goals, the SDGs. And so I will simply invite you, Isabella, to kick off, and then we will hear from Dr. Samia, Dr. Zuba, and Mr. Oumar Diop in succession. Over to you, Isabella.
Thanks very much, Shola. So we have, as PARC, we have decided that it is important for us to take Agenda 2063 as one important point or frame of reference for our mission. And the reasons for that are threefold, if you like. First, we consider it simply as a matter of respect for an institution in the global north, like PARC, that is concerned with Africa to take seriously the continent's own blueprint for its progress. And that, and I'm clear about that, that certainly doesn't mean that we foreclose the need for critical engagement with Agenda 2063, but it is a case of respecting it. Second, Agenda 2063 actually includes goals that speak explicitly to our mission. Goals that speak to the challenge of expanding Africa's research strength, goals that speak to the need for Africa to take its rightful place in the global order, and goals that speak to the critical need for a refocusing and an improvement of Africa's relationships with the world, with international partners to this end. And Agenda 2063 also includes a call on international actors to respect these aspirations and play their part in helping to achieve them. And then lastly, a third reason, but also important, is that I think taking Agenda 2063 as a point of reference for us will enable us and require us to consider how our efforts relate to or might contribute to continental initiatives to strengthen African research. So those are the key rationales that we had as PARC for saying that, yes, we are taking Agenda 2063 as an important point of reference for us. So thanks, Shola.
Thank you very much. Dr. Samia, would you like to come off mute and share your reflections with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Shola. Thank you very much, Isabella. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here with you today. I'm joining you from Johannesburg. And I approach your question, Shola, as a practitioner scholar in international education. I've worked with and for international partnerships in North-South and South-North contexts for more than 20 years now. And so my point of departure is one where I acknowledge that traditional partnerships between Global North and Africa have been very challenging, particularly because they are often characterized by imbalances of power, resources, and knowledge, which tend to disproportionately benefit the North. And so from a South African perspective, particularly facilitated by conversations around decolonization of higher education, there is really a need for change, and there is a need for a paradigm shift in these North-South partnerships. And in that conversation, centering Africa becomes a very important part in bringing about transformation and positive change, because I think it allows us to critically address some of the realities that we experience to this day in North-South partnerships. And these are that traditionally such partnerships are not driven by African agendas. Generally, such partnerships, and I'm quoting one of my research participants, generally such partnerships serve Northern desires more than Southern needs. And traditional and colonial patterns of knowledge production see Africans as recipients rather than producers of knowledge. So for me, it's very exciting to see PARC decide to center Africa and Agenda 2063 specifically in its partnerships and engagements with African institutions, because it signals a very important change. It signals a change of attitude and expectation and perspective. And I think it recognizes that Africans have actually defined for themselves what they want. So it's important for Global North partners to not ask, what do we want and how do we find a partner to make this happen? But to ask, what do we want? What do our partners want? And how can we work together? And I think in that way, we create a foundation for much more balanced and mutually beneficial partnerships between the global North and Africa.
Thank you very much indeed, Samia. Appreciate those reflections. Dr. Zuba, can you take the floor and share some thoughts with us?
Thank you, Shala. Thank you, Isabella, and everybody for having me. I want to go back to 2011 during the NATO bombing of Libya and the debate that was happening during that period. The African Union had a very specific idea and framework to addressing the problem in Libya. But policymakers and research institutions and the popular press basically assumed that, oh, Africans were already implicated because Gaddafi was spending so much money on the continent that the position that they were undertaking or the position that they had nothing to do with actually peace in Libya, but to preserve Gaddafi in power. Fast forward, Libya is bombed to the Stone Age, the country is destroyed, one of the wealthiest countries on the continent is destroyed, Gaddafi dies, and what happened? 10 years later, Libya still grapples with insecurity, it grapples with slave markets. Yes, I'm not talking of 17th century, I'm talking of 21st century slave markets and all of this. Why did this happen? Because African voices were not taken seriously. The point here is to say that Africa actually has traditions of reflective and critical engagement with issues, with its understanding of its own problems. And so for me, when I am asked the question, what is the significance? Why is it important for an institution like PARC to engage with with Agenda 2063? It's precisely because the continent has its own tradition of knowledge production. And if you want to engage with the continent, then you have to engage with the thing that they say is important for them, the thing that they say, this is our own approach to development. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Zuba. Oumar Diop, would you like to come off mute and share your thoughts with us, please, sir?
Merci.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to say hello particularly to my colleague from Senegal, my neighbour. It's a great pleasure, as I said, to be here today and participate in this launch event for PARC. This new institution is going to really contribute to our knowledge and our sharing of knowledge within our region and further abroad. Agenda 2063 really sets out a paradigm shift when it comes to development thinking. We have shared this within our member states and all the various bodies within the African Union. And the importance is really recognized throughout the continent. The universities in Africa have a real role to play in supporting this new vision for research and for partnerships, really focusing on Agenda 2063. We feel that it really does have a great deal of importance when it comes to the university sector. And we feel, therefore, that we can try to share this vision with the rest of the world through these kind of partnerships. The African Union works through partnerships on an international level to really try to spotlight the advantages of sharing knowledge within the political arena and in other sectors when it comes to Agenda 2063 and the various areas involved. we look to university partnerships as part of this. The cooperation between Africa and the global north must really embrace this new vision and try to address some of the inequalities and imbalances that are inherited from the colonial period and that still do affect our situation within the academic sectors today throughout the continent. It's really essential, therefore, to look at the contribution of universities in both Africa and Europe and worldwide to really look at this new agenda and rethink partnerships and the collaboration that can take place. We are looking at knowledge production as a key factor in development in the light of Agenda 2063 to really advance our continental policies. The vision, the concept, and the philosophy of Agenda 2063 really does work hand in hand with PARC's vision when it comes to transforming research and partnerships. And so we really embrace this focus within the African Union, focusing on the relationships between Africa and the global north and reinforcing the positioning of our institutions vis-à-vis Agenda 2063 is an essential way, we feel, of addressing the gaps that still exist when it comes to knowledge sharing and production. We feel that this is a key aspect of our agenda, and this is linked to really giving African universities more autonomy, more independence when it comes to actually spearheading research initiatives within the international arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oumar, and thank you very much to the panelists for sharing those very important thoughts on the importance of AU's 2063 agenda, importance, possibly even the imperative of using that as a guide for the work that PARC is going to do. Let me segue to a follow-up question, now that we've sort of established one of the overarching approaches, and slightly more specifically, what kind of role do we feel institutions of higher education from the global north should play in meeting the call for a refocusing and improvement of partnerships and collaboration? And I wanted this time, we'll start off with Isabella, but perhaps we will reverse the order. And after Isabella, ask Oumar Diop to come on, and then Samia, and finish up with sorry, and then Dr. Zuba, and finish up with Samia, just the reverse order. But first, over to you. Would you like to take that question, Isabella?
Yeah, thanks very much, Shala. So I think there are two things. The first thing I think is simply actually for higher education institutions in the global north as actors, as agents in the research system, to recognize explicitly that they have a role to play together with African partners, together with African institutions. They have a role to play in rebalancing research relationships with Africa. And they need to commit to playing that role, including through change at institutional levels, through policies, through practice, through structures, to ensure that change is enshrined in their cultures. The second thing, if what I said just now pertained to what universities can do individually, the second point is perhaps to consider that higher educations in the global north collectively, and together with partners in Africa again, could collectively, as I said, advocate for change in broader governance or funding or value systems. For example, the criteria used to determine university rankings, but these broader governance, funding or value systems that underpin the workings of the sector as a whole. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Mr. Oumar Diop, would you care to share your comments on that specific point? Monsieur Diop, you're on mute, sir.
Wait. So,
Oh.
Still on mute. Okay. Yeah. So.
Okay, excuse me.
I think I'm on English. Okay, no problem. I think that it is first important that within the framework of this new approach, which you propose here, we look at the intra-African cooperation of the universities. The little of cooperation, though it is increasing over the past decades, but we need to still enhance the cooperation between the African universities to work on Agenda 2063 and African development priorities. It should be something to be enhanced. And secondly, it will be very important to work around to select priorities of areas of work, such as, for example, today, we are talking a lot about African continental free trade area, which is one of the blueprint policy on the continent, and which is receiving a lot of endorsement at the continental level by all member states. And this is, I think, an area where we should put a focus of in terms of investment and achieve something, and accompanying the continent on this sector. And I think another point which is very important to consider is a funding aspect, how to cooperate around mobilizing resources, both at domestic level, at international level. At domestic level, I think there is, Mr. Maroen, you are from the private sector, and you must know that in Africa, the private sector is not using very well the university, but it is vice versa. We cannot blame only the private sector and the university, but it is vice versa. And this partnership between university and private sector should be enhanced, as they can also contribute to financing and reducing this imbalance, which is also stemming from the lack of funding. I was just speaking to my friends in the University of Senegal. They will say, what can we do? We don't have a choice. If the fund is coming from international donors, we have also to do our job. I say, yes, you are right. You have to do your job. It is your work. And the partnership between universities and private sector, as well as the partnership between universities and the public sector, should be really promoted very well. The public sector is even less engaged than the private sector. And they are the one who should put enough money to drive the process in terms of knowledge production in our continent, and link it up to the Agenda 2063 and the continental priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to segue immediately to Dr. Zuba. Would you like to comment on that question and possibly maybe on what Mr. Diop has also shared with us? Over to you, sir.
And normally when I usually say that there is a global intellectual division of labor. And of course, the way in which Africa features in it is a place that you could only apply ideas that are developed from the global north and not a place that is generative of ideas. And that is key. So I think the beginning is to recognize that there is this hierarchy, and the hierarchy always does not play in the interest of Africa. Second, but to also accept and recognize the fact that Africa has a long tradition of knowledge production, a long tradition of debates, and that the continent is not just this place where you go to apply ideas, but that there are really ideas. And so maybe the beginning point for PARC is what you might want to call convivial research. A partnership in which the research that you engage in and the project that you develop is actually based on the lived reality of the continent. So beginning with Agenda 60 and 2063 is a start where you recognize that the continent has its own developmental needs. It is not looking for handout. It's not looking for somebody to come tell them this is what your needs are. But maybe start with the thing that they have identified, which is a Pan-African framework, actually. And what I mean by Pan-African is not just that, African countries. It also goes back to some of the debates in the immediate post-independence period. How do you move the continent forward? How do you integrate forces? And the African University and Research Institute are central to this. So whilst we are engaging with Agenda 2063, we should also think of partnerships. And I think PARC has already started thinking or doing that, right? Think of partnerships with research institutions, with organizations on the continent, to come up with a framework and an agenda in terms of how you go about engaging in this kind of research project and partnership. Not only as somebody at the top who is dictating, but someone who has a lot to learn from what these organizations have to say and present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diop. Appreciate it. Samia, would you like to come on and share your own thoughts on this point?
Yes, thank you very much, Shola. And I will focus on practical implications. I've been a practitioner in the field for much longer than I've been a researcher. And so I would like to frame my response to your question by focusing on people, because people make up institutions and people are the ones who conceptualize and plan and manage and evaluate partnerships. And the European Association for Internationalization of Education, which is AISA's European sister, has an upcoming edition of their Forum magazine. It's the spring edition, and it's titled Europe and the Global South. And when the call for papers came, I submitted a short article in which I reflect on the past, the present, and the future of North-South partnerships in relation to the concepts of colonization, recolonization, and decolonization. And I actually end that piece with three kind of like suggestions, invitations to global North partners to bring about change in their engagements with people in the South and institutions in the South. And so I thought I'll share these with you today as well. And they really center around a commitment to three things: humility, mutuality, and flexibility. And let me just very briefly note what I mean with these. So to have humility for me really means to be aware of positions of power and privilege that Northern partners have in partnerships, and being open also to the possibility of learning from others. You know, very often in the South, we're being approached with partnership proposals that say, what can we do for you? Not what can you do for us? So this expectation that Northern partners can learn from their Southern counterparts, I think, is very important. The second thing is the focus on mutuality and a real commitment to that. And that really means to actively engage Southern partners and to actively make sure that all activities that this partnership involves create benefit and value for everybody and not more for one partner than for another. And the last one is really a certain degree of flexibility. You know, the lived realities in the South are often very, very different from contexts, infrastructures, resources that are available in the North. And so there needs to be a willingness to respond to local realities. And that very often requires a certain degree of flexibility and allowing room for contingency. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Samia. I really appreciate that. And look, in the meantime, a number of questions have come in. We are a little bit pressed for time, so I think what I will do is maybe just select one and at the same time reassure everybody that those questions that we don't get to during this session and they're not directly addressed will be addressed in the future. And we have a number of different channels that we will inform you about in terms of how we will go about doing that. But somebody has raised a very important question here, which is, whether will PARC adopt a Pan-African approach to research, also working with the African diaspora in building worldwide research? And I wonder, Isabella, could I put that one in your lap and ask you to speak to that before we move to the second panel?
Thanks for that. That is a very good and important question. And I would say the need to involve the diaspora, I made reference to that at the beginning, is a really important one. And we have to actually think through how best we do that. We know just from the panelists today that there are pockets of thinking, of initiatives led by the diaspora across the globe that are seeking to foster a change in the research system and to develop research that really benefits Africa at the end of the day. So for us to connect to those, to find ways to work together is going to be really important. That's one. The other is that we do, and I think in embracing Agenda 2060 as a frame of reference, we do see the importance of working with continental bodies such as the African Union, which embodies and is geared to driving the Pan-Africanist vision. So we do see that we need to engage with them in the way we conduct our work and our partnerships. So a really important question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my apologies that we can't take any more questions under our first panel, largely because I haven't managed the time very well. Let me see if I can do better going forward, because we're slightly behind. So I'm now going to transition to our second panel. And when I think about the topic under this one, which is extremely important, many of you, if anybody out there is of my generation, the idea when you hear the term radical transformation, it used to be, or you might be thinking in terms of, yes, civil disobedience. How does one rise up and challenge and overturn the status quo? And I'm reminded of John Lewis, the famous US Congressman, the late John Lewis, who repeatedly, that one of his famous quotes was that you needed to engage in what he used to call good trouble. That was the bedrock for him in terms of civil rights action. But the real question for us is, when we're dealing with the hallowed halls of academia, what does radical transformation mean in practical terms? And that's something we will explore with our next panel. But before we get there, we're going to start off with another video to share with you, just to stimulate some of our thinking. And then I will introduce the panel that will be discussing that question and other questions in a little more detail. Can we have the video, please, on screen?
One of the problems or the challenges, I think, is the whole concept or the practice of agenda setting. So, for example, how do we determine what the most pressing issues are?
I think the most significant imbalances are the ones that you can observe in the worst case scenario, where you have really this very binary, very stark division of labor.
And I think the narrative or the perception that organizations that we work with in general are more times victims, need capacity building. And I think that's a very damaging narrative to have.
Usually it comes based on agenda that are set in the global north. So the problem is a globalized problem that is then localized for us.
We have to allow certain aspects of what we are doing to be led by the people who have the knowledge.
It's a good thing to lobby for more funding, more equitable funding, but at the same time, it's important to continue to do what I think PARC is trying to do, which is to establish a credible voice of research with the resources that are present now.
So if we're not going to do reparations and repatriations, I think that investing heavily in research and making sure that the money and the resources are equally shared is really a minimum step.
I think creating institutions that are actually physically housed or located on the continent matters. There has to be a generation of people who see that it is possible to generate knowledge from very strong institutions, research centers on the continent, and with a majority of its capacity drawn from the continent.
Making these radical changes, these so-called radical changes happen may take less effort than one would presume.
Sorry, there you heard a number of speakers sharing their reflections on this whole concept of radical transformation. And so for our next panel, joining Isabel on the, amongst our panelists will be the following, and I'll just make sure I have all the names correct. It'll be Dr. Aggrey Ambali, the Head of Science and Technology and Innovation Hub, the Africa Union Development Agency. Dr. Catherine Chochibunji, Executive Director of the Africa Population and Health Research Center, and Professor Divine Fu, Director of the Institute of Humanities Africa at the University of Cape Town, and Ms. Nolwanle Lembete, lecturer and PhD student of the Department of Philosophy at Northwest University. And the specific questions that they will be speaking to are the following. If key elements of initiatives to make partnerships more equitable are division of labor and the rewards, what and the co-creation of research agendas, what more is needed? What needs to be done in terms of structural or systemic change beyond these elements? And let me start off with you, Isabella, please.
Thank you, Shola. So I would say the first thing really to underline is that action to ensure more fairness in the division of labor and in access to rewards in research projects is vitally important. And equally critical is agenda setting, of course, ensuring a lead role for Africa in determining what research topics, what specific research questions need to be addressed as a priority in particular contexts and at particular times. That is critical for the use of the generated evidence and its impact, however defined, on policy, on practice, on innovation. But I think we must also consider a number of underlying more systemic imbalances, power imbalances in the research relationships between Africa and the global north. One is simply, and in and of itself, the extensive involvement of the global north in research in or on or for the continent, which contrasts with the negligible involvement of Africa, of African institutions or scholars in research that goes on in the global north. There's a very stark contrast here. For example, you wouldn't expect to hear that scholars from the University of Ibadan are working with colleagues of the University of Cardiff in researching challenges of rural communities in Wales, for example. But of course, the reverse is very much the case. So another imbalance closely related to that is the whole development frame. And I think Zuba alluded to it earlier. The development frame which posits the global north as developed and Africa as developing, and inevitably implies a gaze from the north to Africa with a focus on helping the continent address its development challenges. Rarely is the gaze returned, let alone reversed. And a last imbalance, perhaps particularly salient in the social sciences or perhaps in interdisciplinary work, is the dominant, I would say almost exclusive use of Western theories or concepts to shape the collection of and interpret information on realities in the continent. Rarely is room, let alone precedence, given to the use of existing African theories or to explicit new African theorizing to understand realities in the continent, and even less so to understand realities in the global north or in the world as a whole. And this cements northern universities as the site of knowledge, of theory production, and African institutions as the site of consuming or applying those theories and those bodies of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Aggrey, would you like to come off and can you share with us your reflections?
Yes, moderator, thank you very much. Let me start by congratulating PARC for its launch today. I think this whole issue is quite important. In order for us to decolonize the relationship between the global north and Africa, I think let me indicate that I work for the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, new partnership for Africa's development, which deals with partnership. And I have, for close to a decade, 2 decades now, been brokering partnerships, between at the AU level in research. Within the continent as well as outside the continent. Now, I think as we look into this whole issue of decolonization, probably we should look at it from both ends, the global north as well as the African side. One of the issues is the co-ownership of the research agenda. I think it is increasingly, being accepted now, that the research questions in Africa are becoming more and more novel, to the global world. The research agendas are becoming new and new every time. I know, several universities, even Bristol is known for doing a lot of fish biology work in the Great Lakes of Africa. Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi. But one thing why do they go there? They go there because the species that they find in those lakes are unique to those particular lakes. So they are endemic. And the same is also true when it comes to public health. You find that the health challenges in Africa, some of them are unique to Africa. We have got diseases that are unique to Africa. So basically, what we need there is that we need to have an agenda that is co-owned by both the global north and the African partners. The second issue, as I said, moderator, that I would like to look at both sides, is the issue of co-governance of the partnerships. I think governance issues, they keep coming up, in research collaborations and partnerships. There's need for a balanced roles and balanced roles and responsibilities in the governance of the partnerships. The challenge that we tend to face, and basically I am indebted with these sort of challenges, is that you find that one institution presents itself as a sole decision maker on the oversight of the partnership. I think it has been common in the global north, but also I think African institutions, as they engage with the partnerships, they also need to actually realize that it's a partnership, in which case the governance has to be harnessed. So it has to be from both sides. The other issue is what I would call co-synergistic benefit. I think colleagues have talked about this. It has been common that we come into this partnership, but the global north is there to build the capacity of Africans. I think so. It's one direction, but we should actually, have this understanding that the reality on the ground is that both sides actually do benefit. So there's co-learning, and co-capacity strengthening on both sides of the partnership. And to wind up, Mr. Moderator, is the whole issue of innovative domestic financing. I think African institutions, African governments have been characterized as not investing in these partnerships. But I think it's time that we started actually valuing, the in-kind contribution. There's a lot of infrastructure that African governments, African institutions contribute to these research partnerships. It's in kind, but it's not recognized as, as contribution. I think we need to actually start quantifying those in-kind contributions. So, in overall, I think the key thing here is humility. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The word humility comes up again. Can we move to you, Dr. Catherine Chobutunji? Can we hear from you, please, on this point?
So thanks very much, everyone, and I'm really pleased to be participating in this conversation. And I have 2 minutes, and my submission revolves around how good intentions on the eco-partnership can be and must be mainstreamed in the global knowledge ecosystem, keeping in mind that the ecosystem has multiple stakeholders. And so I'll focus my submission on 2 sets of stakeholders. And the first is actually researchers in the global south. I'm one of them. And so we're usually at the receiving end of, and sometimes unwitting participants in inequitable partnerships. And so what I would say is that we need to give form and definition to what is inequitable to us, define what it is, and then institutionalize rejection of such inequity. Because I would say that inequitable partnerships persist because we accept them, and the starting point is to reject them. And this is not intended to absolve, for lack of a better word, the perpetrators of inequity, but to approach this from a point of agency and say that as long as we are recipients of benevolence from the global north, even benevolence to dismantle inequitable partnerships, I don't think we'll break the cycle. So we need to institutionalize rejection, but we need to first define what is inequitable, understand it. And there's a common term these days on social media about normalizing. We need to normalize rejecting inequity. That's the first set of stakeholders. The second set, I would say, are funders of research, because funders have the means, the resources, and the influence to shape practice. And they've been able to shape practice, for instance, around the open science space. And there have been several attempts in the recent past where funding agencies have attempted to operationalize measures against inequitable partnerships. For instance, having some kind of loose metrics to sort of define what inequitable partnerships look like, and then using those loose metrics in making funding decisions. I would say they need to go further, and they need to tighten those metrics. And once they've tightened them, they need to mainstream them. Good science or good research must be defined not just from how scientifically rigorous or groundbreaking it is, but from its transformative impact on the global research and science ecosystem, as well as its value, society, beyond the production of new knowledge. And once these metrics are, as I said, so we need to define what is good and then mainstream it. And mainstreaming means we may need to reach a point where inequitable partnerships in very well-written groundbreaking research proposals become a disqualifier, just as bad science is. So I'm happy to continue this conversation, but I see a role for those two sets of stakeholders. As I've said, there are many stakeholders in the ecosystem, but for 2 minutes, I think I'll just stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking submission. I'm going to ask Professor Fine from South Africa to come on. Professor Fu, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Just to correct that, I have not acquired the privileges to be professor. So I just call me divine. You know, I'm still, even when you call me a doctor, my grandmother will not recognize me. So, but just to congratulate PARC on this important initiative, and also just bringing together a group of scholars. I think during the time of a pandemic like this, and also a time when everybody is seeking to close borders and doing everything, you know, to contain themselves within specific spaces, institutions that actually push people to begin to speak, and especially bring Africans to talk to each other, is really important. And I think my contribution is going to focus on what Poleno Tonji has contributed in terms of what he calls extroversion. That the only ways in which one can be able to build more meaningful partnerships, and in which you know, we can begin to bring to life this Agenda 2063 that we are investing in, is to invest really in rethinking this notion of extroversion and what it means to introvert, you know. And I'm going to suggest 3 things. One is just to ignore the North, you know, completely. It's the second is to abandon, you know. We are spending time trying to struggle with concepts such as stakeholder. I don't really know what that really means when one applies it practically. We are talking about matrices, one that really doesn't know. And also this obsession with agendas, you know, because we are living in a continent which has gotten a completely different relationship with time and the future and the present. And we have to ask ourselves, what should we be focusing on? Should we be invested in the present? Should we be invested in the future? Should we be looking at the past? And I think these are really key, because we do not have time to sit and reflect on these things. So we are always jumping on the next bus. It's now 2020 for all, we have health for all 2020. It's now end of the millennium, we have end of the millennium. It's now SDGs, we have 2063. So there's really hardly any patience, you know, to wait and engage with ourselves and with our reality. So that's why I'm suggesting that a lot of these concepts and notions that have come to frame our own reality are notions that we actually need to abandon, and disconnect from. And then that takes me to respond to Apolline Otonji's request or critique for extroversion. That we exist, for others, and when one looks at the agenda, which of course is produced by Africans and reflects African realities and has engaged lots of other Africans, and the question is, who is this agenda created for? Is this agenda developed to ensure that it actually reflects and engages with everybody's realities in this space? Or is this an agenda which just puts us in line to meet with global goals? I think it's more of the latter rather than the former. And that is why I am pushing that we need to invest more in revaluing, perhaps to take seriously, because I am also an anthropologist, to take seriously a concept that we have seem to have abandoned, or we seem to have tainted over the past years, which is a culture, because culture gives us access, to begin to conceptualize and invest in conceptualizing some of the important issues that will help us to begin to engage in this partnership. One cannot get into a partnership or into an equitable partnership when one doesn't really have what to offer, when one hasn't really invested, in objectives or particular outcomes or milestones that one wants to achieve. This year, we will be commemorating more than 60 years since many African countries got independence. And we're still talking about, the North. I would like to see that, especially within the context of this Africa Free Trade Agreement, that we begin to engage each other more equitable, that this partnership is something that we invest in locally, within countries, between countries, between regions, more than rather than continuously, focusing on the North. So to conclude, I will emphasize what many of my colleagues have already emphasized, which is the importance of Africa focus, the importance of an introversion, the importance of us beginning to ask a serious questions about many of the concepts that we are applying, and also therefore asking what the importance of partnerships with the North really are. So I'm saying we should ignore, we should abandon, and we should revalue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've certainly responded to the question of radical transformation. Nolwande, would you like to come off mute? Let's hear from you, please.
Thank you, Shola, and thank you, Isabella, for the invite as well. For me, I'm going to be approaching it from a very philosophical perspective. And Divine, I can only hope one day to also be unrecognized as a doctor, as I'm also just working towards my PhD. So for me, it's the realization of epistemic good, or the epistemic good that African knowledge systems can contribute to conversations, which is important for me. It's a realization of equity and how African institutions of higher learning in particular need to be recognized for their intrinsic value, not the value that's placed upon them by the Northern gaze as well. It's also important that within the epistemic, the exchange within the epistemic economy, resources are available to African institutions and African researchers, because one of the most disappointing things that I've encountered is looking for a book, an African philosophy book that's written by an African for Africans, and it's only available on Amazon US or UK, and it's not available to us in South Africa, which I just find to be so contradictory, because it's a book that we need to be using for our own epistemic good, but it's published by European published houses. So we need, as African researchers as well, to have institutions or ways in which we can publish and create our own knowledge that's unanswerable to the Northern gaze or European standards of publication, language, and consumption. There's also a very particular way in which African research can contribute towards global knowledge, and it doesn't have to be comparable to European standards at all. It can be autonomous and credible in its own methodology and in its own existence. So my main frame of reference in how things can structurally change is
first by recognizing the intrinsic value of the knowledge that we have to offer, not how that value can be commodified or exchanged for something in particular, but just how it is important in and of itself, and how it produces an authentic and unique response to the problems that we're facing within epistemology, with higher education, and as researchers as well in the global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nwandle. Much appreciated. I'm going to move to a supplementary question that I had in mind, which is, what would be three, just by way of example, three key end states? Sorry about that. And I had disabled this, believe it or not. What would be key goals in terms of end states that would demonstrate radical transformation? What would be key goals for incremental change toward this? And how do we ensure that incremental progress toward transformation incorporates accountability on the part of higher education institutions in the global North? And we'll just reverse the order. Let me start off with you, Isabella, and then we'll come back and go with Nwandle, Divine, Catherine, and then Aggrey. Over to you, Isabella.
Thanks very much, Shola. So I think that the question of end states, is still something that we need to think through. If we talk about a transformation in the system, in the research system, in which African institutions, terms, interests, knowledge take their rightful place, what does that look like, and what does it look like across sciences, for example, across the sciences? We need to unpack this more. But having said that, I think what would be important very broadly, I would say, is a situation where broad as well as specific agendas for research in Africa are set in the continent, where involvement of the global North in research in Africa is matched by African involvement in research in the global North. So this mutuality, where the gaze is returned or even reversed, if you like, and a situation where African theories or new African theorizing is used to understand realities in the continent and globally. And there is true cross-fertilization with Western knowledge frames. But as I said, we need to unpack this much more than we have done so far. And so a key shorter term goal, to my mind, would be a concerted effort to work out what the desired end states are and what steps need to be taken, what change is needed at what level, at the level of individual researchers on projects, at the level of institutions or broader systems to get there. And how to ensure commitment to and accountability for such change among global North institutions, well, this is really critical to my mind. And I think, well, explicit statements of intent, for example, in institutions' overall strategies would be a start. But there is also a role, I think, for thinking about developing a collective framework that is co-owned by Africa and global North institutions, that captures commitment and guides and recognizes and rewards positive change on the part of organizations. And some of you might be familiar with the Athena Swan Charter that is driving work towards greater gender equity or gender equality in higher education. And my sense is that could perhaps be a useful model for us to consider here when we're talking about a collective framework that captures commitment and then ultimately also accountability to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, much appreciated. Nwandle, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Shola. So the three elements that I'd like to focus on that will contribute towards transformation in higher education and accountability is epistemic credibility, conversationalism, as well as a point on methodologies. So when you're speaking about epistemic credibility, it's a term that I've taken from Miranda Frick's Epistemic Injustice, but it's basically the credibility that's given upon a particular speaker of knowledge by the hearer, where sometimes that credibility is not recognized because of a certain prejudice that a particular hearer might have on the speaker of knowledge. And so maybe if we had more of an accountability in terms of epistemic credibility and giving more credibility to the knowledge that is being produced, the things that are being spoken, and the methods that are being used in Africa to create sort of an epistemic environment that is globally impactful. So perhaps we need to have a point where what is said by people and people in Africa is taken more seriously and is given more credit. The second is conversationalism, which I've taken from Jonathan Chimakunam. And this is basically where epistemology reaches a point where there are what he calls horizontal states of philosophical conversations, as well as vertical philosophical questions that are being asked. And everybody that is participating in the philosophical conversation and who is asking philosophical questions is an equal player within the spectrum. And everybody who is participating in the process of knowledge production is considered equally as a player. And this comes in when we're speaking of the question of, in particular, African philosophy, where first African philosophy has to prove its existence before it can be promoted as a discipline. And once it has done the job of proving that an African philosophy exists, Richard Amose goes on to say that, you know, you can't say an African philosophy doesn't exist if African people exist. So we should be concretizing the existence of African philosophy. And on top of that, what is usually asked of African philosophy is for it to sort of assimilate into some form of a European structure or another. In philosophy, African philosophy will be asked to either go into continental or into analytical philosophy. And it's almost like it can't stand on its own autonomously as a philosophy. It first has to lean on certain philosophies, European philosophies first, before its existence can be validated. So I think if we want to have equal conversations, that's part of the thing, what we have to let go of in building epistemic credibility, is recognizing and engaging with the autonomy of African philosophy and philosophers and researchers as well. And so when you're looking at the point of assimilation, and it always seems to be the case with African studies of any kind, where they're expected to assimilate into a particular Eurocentric view. And once they've assimilated into that view, only then do they become valid or relevant. And so if we stop seeking this assimilation, we stop seeking this validation from European institutions, and we know that the work that we are doing is valid in and of itself, then we can begin to create, which is part of my third point, unique methodologies that we can use to gain information. Recently in my studies and in my PhD, I've decided to do what most philosophers don't do, which is to actually have quantitative research as part of my research. And I did it's a comparative study that was first done in the United States, which was comparing epistemic intuitions. And the study was then replicated and found to be false. But then when it was replicated in almost every country or continent in the world except in Africa. And so when I decided to go, okay, let me try and replicate the study in Africa using surveys as my methodology. As my research went on, I found that, you know, maybe surveys were not the most effective methodology to use, especially if you want to find sort of a grassroots level of knowledge systems. The best thing to do is to actually just converse with people, is to have conversations with people. And so I realized within my study that even though my study required a particular methodology, that methodology doesn't necessarily work for the information that I was trying to find for the community that I'm in. And unfortunately, because of COVID, most of these conversations couldn't happen because most of the communities that are highly indigenous don't have the internet connectivity that we can have, where we can have Zoom meetings, and I couldn't go there and see them. So I think methodology is important in how we approach African knowledge systems. How are we collecting the information? How are we collecting the data as well? Because if we then look at that, then we have to look at also, which was also a fundamental problem that I faced, was I had to translate my study from English to isiZulu without losing the fundamental meaning of the concept. And that's where you start to realize that languages can also offer very very precise philosophical insights, because the way in which a word is translated in isiZulu from English is very different, and a single word can mean many things in isiZulu. And so sometimes the concept doesn't translate, or even if the concept translates between languages, it's not going to, the question is not going to resonate the same way, because I'm using a highly Eurocentric methodology trying to translate it into isiZulu, and it's just not resonating. So maybe there's a different way in which you can look at methodologies and how we approach methodologies within African communities, how we look at African languages, how languages are used within communities, and how there is knowledge in that, and how there's knowledge in those customs. In that way, we're creating our epistemes that have depth, but they're also autonomous in themselves. They can stand for themselves, and they can stand up by themselves, not needing to lean on any Eurocentric gazes, not needing to lean on any Eurocentric philosophies or methodologies. So for me, that would be those are the three pivotal points for me that I think would contribute towards transformation. And I'm speaking from my very particular context and philosophy. It's epistemic credibility, it's the way in which conversations are taking place, and it's the methodology in which those conversations are taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nwande, for that detailed submission. I'm afraid under normal circumstances, the plan was to listen to the three other panelists, but unfortunately we are running behind time. And so I do apologize to your colleagues, Divine, Catherine and Aggrey. We are going to have to move on. I do want to encourage folks going forward. The idea is for everybody to speak for 2 minutes. And remember, we are basically trying to start a conversation. We're not trying to conclude it. The idea is to share a few reflections, food for thought, and we will have time to come back to these later on the website or on future engagement. So if I can just re-emphasize that we are also seeing a number of questions coming, fascinating questions coming from the floor, which we might not be able to get to until after panel 3, but a number of them are focusing on the practical side of what we're trying to do. The message seems to be, oh, look, yeah, we've heard this kind of vision before, very important, but are you sure you're going to have the support from the African side? What are the realities in terms of how we implement things? So I just put that on the table so that as we move to the next panel and engage the next panelists, you might think about that and keep that at the back of your mind. So just to say that we've already spent a fair amount of time today looking at the role of African institutions and the need to focus on elevating and supporting the leadership of African institutions in partnership. And now I want us to turn a little bit to where the responsibility and accountability of Northern institutions lies. And some of this has been touched on already, but particularly in those countries in which there is a complicated history and something that's equally complex, and where there are vibrant diaspora communities who are keen to play a role in the decolonization of those institutions and relationships. And some of what we've heard already has touched on that. There have been questions already in that line. But let's start off with a video, and then we will introduce the panelists who are going to speak on and share their reflections on this theme. Can we have the video, please, Griffin?
It's a particularly apposite time to reflect on the decolonization agenda and the role of PARC potentially in relation to that.
And I think, having worked with the university at this stage, I think it has that aspiration, even in the city, around anti-racism, thinking about its own history, but the test will be in the implementation.
It is of vital importance that we develop relationships that don't repeat colonial inequities, but actually that are based on very basic human principles of equity, of respect, of mutual trust, and I think actually in friendship.
In all of these processes, there's a very important role for capacity development initiatives, and I think PARC can help transform our understanding of that. Something very tangible we can do is ensure that African partners play a leadership role in every stage of the research.
Is it a radical vision? Is it a transformative vision? I think that is the key. And if that's the case, then how do you achieve that?
PARC is well positioned to have an influence, an impact on the wider funding environment. We're an interdisciplinary centre with a wide reach into development, into funding organisations. We can make our voices heard.
Thank you very much indeed. And joining Isabella on the panel for this final panel are three. Professor Alex Ezeh, the Professor of Global Health at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. Dr. Anne McKenna, the Program Coordinator at Africa, University of Oxford. And Professor Tumani Corrah, Director of the Africa Research Excellence Fund. And we've asked each of them, as with the previous panelists, to share with us their own thoughts, but specifically 3 suggestions about what PARC should prioritize to encourage incremental steps toward a systemic transformation in how the University of Bristol engages in research partnerships with African institutions. And so I'm going to, let me start off first of all with you, Isabella. And let me hand the floor over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Shala. I think the first thing to say is that PARC, we in isolation really cannot effect any change on our own, and nor should we, in fact. What we need to do is to bring together people, bring together the rich thinking and the initiatives that already exist and are growing every day on the continent, in the university, in the UK and elsewhere, and catalyze and provide forums for raising the right questions and developing answers and learning together. And building on this, there are perhaps 3 areas that we think we need to prioritize. So a first priority is to foster debate, inquiry. We're starting it now. Thought leadership on the kind of transformation in Africa research and partnership that is needed. And what steps, what approaches, what holistic approaches are required at what levels to get there. And then building on this, I think we need to work towards developing a collective framework, as I mentioned, co-owned by Africa and Northern institutions that captures and guides and recognizes and rewards institutional commitment to such change. And our current work with the Global Africa Group of the Worldwide Universities Network, with Divine as a co-lead, and our work in exploring the development of a charter for transformed Africa research and partnership are beginnings in that respect. The second priority is to then actually apply and then foster learning on new approaches to Africa research and partnership in practice. And we are working to catalyze capstone programs of interdisciplinary research and engagement to this end across substantive fields. One is care systems and economies. At the moment, we're already embarking on 2 active projects, one funded by the Hewlett Foundation, one by Danida. A second is sexual reproductive health and rights. And a third is water management, hygiene and sanitation. And we expect that there will be other areas which we explore putting these new approaches in practice. And then a third priority, and this has come up several times, is that we need to engage in promoting mutual capacity strengthening, to embed new ways for the next generation of scholars, both those trained in the University of Bristol, working in the University of Bristol, as well as in Africa, to conduct global North Africa research and partnerships in a different way, in new ways. And to this end, we're exploring where and how we engage, where we can engage with Africa-led research capacity strengthening initiatives, such as, for example, Carter or PASSET. So these are the 3 priorities that I think PARC needs to be focusing on in the next few years, but I'm really keen to hear what the other panelists have to say. Thank you, Shola.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we ask Professor Alex Ezeh, I believe, to come off mute and share some of his thoughts?
Thank you, Shola. Let me start by saying that I do not believe that incremental changes, no matter how meaningful and well-meaning they are, will ever lead to systemic transformation of deep-rooted and century-old systems of unequal partnerships between Africa and the global north. It just would not happen like that. We are looking for what PARC is calling urgent and radical transformations, and that's what is needed. So what can PARC do? I think I should not pretend that I can tell PARC what to do. They have a funding from a funder to do certain things, and they will go on with that. But if I'm to think, what can PARC contribute to these conversations? I think the primary priority for PARC is to be able to be clear on where it stands on the issue of transforming research partnerships in Africa. In particular, that it is part of the solution and it is not accentuating the problem. PARC is seeking to foster a marriage between two parties. One of them is at best what I would call, very superstitious in a way, and the other is cynical in those relationships. And you're trying to somehow come in between them and create a conversation around those. So how do you do that? I think there are three things, and Catherine spoke to some of these before. The first is to speak within the University of Bristol. This is not about Bristol. It's not about getting more students from Africa, having larger projects in Africa, doing this in Africa and other. That era is gone. It is about the University of Bristol understanding what the conversation is about and being willing to decide at the highest levels of leadership that it is willing to champion this cause. If this is the case, then PARC can help the University of Bristol to come up with a set of values and principles that should guide and govern their partnerships with Africa. And that has to be shared within Bristol and across the partners that you want to work in Africa. The second constituency that PARC needs to prioritize and speak to is to facilitate intra-African conversations around these issues. Catherine spoke to that in a moment, but I want to say that, we need to refocus that gaze on ourselves. Why is it that 70 to 79% of our research outputs are in partnership with people outside of Africa, and only 2 to 3% are with other Africans? Why is it that if this meeting was convened by University of Zambia or Makerere or University of Ibadan, are all the Africans on this panel willing to have made the same commitment to speak at that panel? There are questions we need to ask. What does this equal partnerships mean to us? How do we facilitate that? What is our role within this? Those conversations need to be facilitated within the continent, and we need to engage in those. And the third and last area is constituency is to talk to the funders and funding partners, starting with Perivoli Foundation, which has funded the Institute. I think here we celebrate their interest in supporting the University of Bristol to lead this charge. And I went to their website and I saw a lot of things that actually gladdened my heart. They said our focus is on Africa. Time is of the essence. Solutions must come from within. The choices people make for themselves are invariably the better ones. And we must let Africa decide for itself. These bold statements, and I can understand why, even with these bold statements, they are making the initial grants to the University of Bristol. But the question is, where would the next investment be in supporting Africa? Where would they make that next investment? The AFDB, the African Development Bank, hosted a meeting about a month ago on a global community of practice. They call it Strengthening Institutional Capacity for Inclusive Development in Africa. And their goal is to set up a multi-billion trust fund to support knowledge and capacity development on the continent. And I think this is exactly the type of initiatives that groups like the Perivoli Foundation could support and engage with, so that we actually have a movement that is going on within the continent that connects with the global conversations. The unfortunate thing is that these conversations are happening in the global north and very little is happening in Africa. And if you are going to have a true partnership, this conversation needs to be happening on both sides of the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. Dr. Anne McKenna, can we hear from you, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation today. I come from the practitioner's side, as Samia mentioned before, having worked on setting up very similarly oriented project in the University of Oxford, the Africa-Oxford Initiative. We've been running for a few years now. So my reflections will be based on our experience for the last few years. And mine are really sort of a voice of caution or a voice of discord, as it were, to some of the questions we need to think about when we're setting up these kinds of initiatives and what we should bear in mind as we start. And probably further down the line, we'll come back to these questions and ask ourselves, are we still true to our vision? And one of the questions is what voices do we mask on both sides of the divide? What perspectives do we leave out when we become Northern institutions and African colleagues? Whose voices do we privilege? I mean, Nolwandla mentioned a bit about the specific individuals or institutions that we baptize to become the spokespeople for African institutions or for African researchers. And then we end up having very limited view, limited perspectives, because we've decided that these are the experts, these are the people that we'll be listening to. Who do we leave out when we create platforms for networking that are still, based on the models that we've had for years before? So I think that's one question that I think we need to reflect on, those of us who are developing platforms for networking, platforms for partnerships. The second question I think that will be important to think about is how much room are we leaving for uncomfortable interactions? Because true mutuality, true relationships between individuals arise when you have honest and real human interactions. And a lot of the times when we create these platforms, we end up doing the job of refereeing relationships or sort of pacifying places so that people can feel that they can say what is right to say, but not necessarily what they actually feel. And so in our role of creating opportunities for debate and so forth, how much do we leave room for uncomfortable interactions and comfortable conversations that would actually be the basis of genuine and honest relationships moving forward? Last thing I want to present is to sort of highlight is and has come up several times today, is the question of understanding our limits as knowledge translators, as people who are keen to support partnerships. What is the limit of what we can actually do? There are roles, as my colleagues have said before, for the African Development Bank, for African institutions themselves, for African governments to play. Where do we know to stop? And how do we know that this is no longer our job to do and step back and let the people who are best suited to do the job to do it? A lot of this work will be happening in the continent. And sometimes the best thing we can do in the global north is just get out of the way. So I'm going to leave it there for now.
Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. Professor Tumani Corrah, would you like to come on screen, please?
Thank you very much, Shola, and thank you very much, Isabella, and thank you, colleagues. I'm reminded of the cocoa analogy. The cocoa is grown in Ghana and in other parts of Africa. And the chocolates is made in the north. Think about that. 10 years ago, if you looked at the world's literature, you'll find this same old story. Africa constitutes 17% of the world's population, harbors 25% of the world's disease. Africans publish only 3% of the global population. Has that changed? After 50 years of different universities extending their warmth to the African continent in terms of research? There I say no, because the latest BMJ report shows that of the numbers of publications on the COVID pandemic, only 3% are from Africa and Africans. Nothing has changed in 50 years. I do hope that Bristol will bring in a new challenge that will bring solutions. Strictly speaking, in my own view, and I'm going down my list because others have already really expressed some of the top points I had. So I'm going right down. But let us try and support the African emerging scientists. Bristol should champion this together with colleagues from the North. Get our fellows, our young people, to start writing successful competitive grants. Let them know how to translate an interesting research question into a fundable research project. Let them develop the skills required for publication so that they can now start mounting publications in high impact journals. Research that will impact on policy that will benefit our population, our people, and our governments. Too much has been said about our African women in science. Suffice it to say, not making maximum use of our women in science, I can only simply interpret as having two hands, yet using one hand to carry out your home chores. And the final thing I like to see Bristol really propagate is that develop capacity in research leadership. Every research leader needs leadership skills for the research context. They need individual leadership qualities, team and institutional and disciplinary strategies for larger scale impact and innovation. I hope when we gather in 5 years' time, we will be able to say, Africa represents 17% of the world's population and harbors 15% of the world's burden of disease. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Tumani. And let me just say, I'm rushing to move on to a supplementary question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to the questions, many of which are really thought-provoking, that are coming through us through Slido and so forth. But we will not end the conversation here. We will continue with this conversation either on the website or in future webinars. So please do not be discouraged. We'll get back to you if your question is not being addressed here. But as a follow-up question, how and where should PARC and the University of Bristol engage in broader debates or initiatives in order to provide an example to and inspire, of course, other institutions in the UK, in the global north, and more broadly elsewhere? I'm going to start off with you, Isabella, and then maybe ask just in reverse order, Professor Corrah, followed by Dr. Anne McKenna and Professor Alex Ezeh, just to give a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shola. So I think the very fact that we can only work by bringing together people and thinking in all that we do and all that we aspire to do, that in itself will offer a basis and an opportunity for other institutions on both sides of the ocean, as Alex put it, to join the conversation about what change is needed, and then not just the conversation, but then actually taking steps along that journey. In more concrete terms, perhaps I would say that our intention to work with others, think through with others, the development of a collective co-owned framework or a charter, as we've termed it, that will guide and recognize and reward institutional level commitment to changing the way in which Global North institutions engage with African partners and vice versa. That could be a really important way of cementing and perhaps then progressively attracting others to join the journey and to join the progress towards change in the right direction. I'll stop there, Shola, in the interest of time.
So I was on mute. Please go ahead, Professor Corrah. Over to you, sir. I think you're on mute, Professor.
Thank you very much. I will humbly suggest that Bristol, first of all, forms an all-inclusive committee with strong African representation so that you know what the African continent really needs. And then I would not approach institutions. I rather I'll put out a call and get willing partners to join in and work together. If it works with the first 2 or 3 that you select, it will amazingly get people interested and wanting to join in. That would be my approach to this. We need to do something radically different to change things.
as I said, I looked at the citation index publications of last year, and there were 6,040 high-ranking scientists based on how many times people checked or referred to their publications. And you know how many of those were from an African continent? 15 out of 6,040. Wow. We need a radical change. The change is needed now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That says it all. Really appreciate those thoughts. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Anne McKenna, over to you, please.
Thank you. That's really thought-provoking. I think you start internally, really. There's often times we want to do things with African colleagues, with African institutions and so forth, but internally our own students, our own staff from the continent are being stifled. They're barely able to do their own work. And so it's really, I think, hypocritical in a way to start doing all the things outside in the global world and all of that, while internally we haven't set our house in order. I think that's the first place to start. The second, there's a whole lot of organizations that have similar visions. I mean, our own organization, Africa Oxford Initiative is one of them. There's Cambridge Africa, there's the LSE group, there's a whole group as well in SOAS and other UK universities that you can start the conversation with internally and clean up the act, as it were, because it's really difficult to come out and say we are about supporting equitable partnerships, raising the voices of African colleagues and increasingly supporting the work that is coming from the continent. Well, we can't do that even in our own small communities. How do we propose to do that externally outside our own institutions? I think that would be a good place to start thinking about.
Thank you, great. Thank you so much. Start internally, let's be practical. Professor Alex Ezeh, can I just get a final word on this topic from you, please, just briefly? We are badly against time, but if you could just give us a couple of thoughts. Professor Alex Ezeh, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Shola. I think I agree with Anne that the starting point is to be internal, and within Drexel, within PARC and Bristol, ensure that you actually understand what this conversation is about. And you are willing to center African voices and not Bristol voices in the engagement with Northern UK and global institutions. Failure to do that, we could actually make those engagements perpetuate the systemic inequities that you're trying to address. And the second is maybe think about culture change internally. And where Africa is seen as a partner, and as you engage, you're seeing them not just as a group to help, where you're going to build their capacity, but it's actually thinking about them as you would think any other UK partner as a partner. You're thinking about Africa as a partner. And the initiative I talked about from the African Development Bank is something that, as it takes shape and comes to life, is something that PARC and Bristol could step up boldly to speak for such initiatives and mobilize buy-in from institutions and sponsors who could do that. My final point is to recognize that as we talk about Africa's partnership with the global north, we need to recognize that this is not, Africa is not having a monolithic type of relationship with just the global north. Within the global north, you're having partnerships with every other region of the world. And what we are looking to is to center that conversation and relationship within all the other partnerships Africa is having, both with itself internally and with the other parts of the world. It's coming in there and recognizing that this partnership is existing within a network of other partners. And so the isolation of Africa that is almost like a reserve of global north, and we only partner with the global north, needs to change. And we need to bring everybody within those. And the test of that will say, would Bristol be willing to be a junior partner in a multi-country partnership led from Africa that includes partners from Latin America and Asia and other parts of the world? I think that's really where this conversation needs to go to.
Thank you very much indeed. I do apologize if it seems as if I'm like a man in a hurry. It's because I am, and we are several minutes behind time. And so I'm going to rush forward to proceed to what is effectively the concluding part of this particular engagement, which really has been extremely thought-provoking. The number of questions that have come up has been immensely helpful. But I think I'm going to hand over now to our board chair, Professor Aiti, who is just down the coast from where I am here in the Gambia, from Ghana. and he's our chair of the PARC board. And maybe I can ask you, sir, to come off mute and join us and share a few words.
Thank you very, very much, Shola. Thank you very, very much. I mean, I've really enjoyed everything that has taken place this morning. The discussion has been extremely rich and quite enlightening for me. There are a number of things that clearly we have seen today. We appreciate the fact that there are so many stakeholders who share in the vision of PARC, who believe that the mission that we've adopted is the right one. And I'm very happy about that. Clearly, there's a lot of illustration here of the kinds of ideals that PARC should be pursuing. And those ideals are very much in line with what others in Africa believe and also would like to put out there. So that makes me very, very happy. What resonated very well with me at a very personal level, I run a network of 16 African universities trying to do exactly what we are talking about today. These 16 universities want to be the producers of the knowledge that will transform the region. They believe strongly that it is African institutions that must lead the charge in bringing about change. And of course, they know they cannot do it alone. They need partnerships. So a body like PARC is very, very welcome. A body like PARC reflects the kinds of ideals in terms of partnership that African universities want. So that's something that came across to me, and I thought, my members would be extremely happy with that. But I think it goes well beyond the members of my network. It goes well beyond that to other African institutions. The African Union is very well represented here today, and I'm quite sure they believe strongly in what we are talking about. So the fact that we are willing to engage in a discussion about decolonization, the fact that we are willing to talk about transformation, the fact that we are willing to talk about reconstruction, these are things that must be discussed properly in the region. And I am glad that PARC is opening the door for doing that. So let me thank the PARC team for the hard work that have been put into preparing this webinar. A lot of work, Isabella and your team, you've been wonderful, and the board appreciates all of that very, very much. I would like to thank the panelists and the video participants who basically spend a lot of time trying to provide us with information that we need to move forward. So I thank them very much. The University of Bristol has been great, providing a platform that offers change. It's a platform that offers change in the way Bristol itself relates to Africa, and many universities are ready for that kind of change. And I appreciate what Bristol is doing in this regard. Something that I hope in the coming years we will see bear fruit that will benefit all of us. The University of Bristol Management, we do hope that you continue to support PARC the way you began. I heard the commitment from the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the beginning. That commitment is something that we will always hold in very high esteem. We will enjoy the relationship that we've developed with the management of the university. And then towards the other partners, the Ferivoli Foundation, we appreciate what you've done for PARC in this short period. The gesture, I believe, is one that is going to encourage many other donors in the UK and elsewhere to consider supporting PARC. Something that is going to make various funders look at how the example that PARC is setting can be used as a template for future relations between UK universities and African universities and institutions. So I thank you all very much for this. It's been an eye-opener for me, and I do hope that the board has learned adequately from this experience, and in the coming meetings, we'll be able to reflect on them more fully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayiti. Really appreciate that. Isabella, let me just hand over to you to conclude with a few thoughts, and then we'll wrap up. But let me hand over to you, please.
Thank you, Shola. And I have only one more thing to say, really, which is just to express our, when I say our, on behalf of the PARC team, our extreme gratitude to all of you. To the audience, we haven't been able to engage with you as much as we've hoped, but we will continue the conversation, and there is information in the chat box on how exactly we're going to do that. To all the panelists, the conversation has been more than I dared to hope for. As you say, so many rich perspectives, ideas that we will take very seriously and try to bring into the work that we do going forward. And Alex, your point about centering African voices, I think we've made a start today, just in the panelists and in the discussions that we've had today, and we intend to continue. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. It's been a huge privilege, a huge pleasure. Thank you to Bristol University, and thank you to the Perivoli Foundation for, in many ways, making this all possible. And we look forward to engaging with you as we go forward as much as we can, as richly as we can. So you all go well, and thank you very much once more. Over to you, Shola, for the last few words. And thank you to you, Shola, for guiding us so wonderfully.
Thank you very much. I certainly have no more words. Apologies for not guiding you a little more, with a little more discipline. So we've run over time. But thank you for those who have stayed on, and for those who are not here. Yes, we extend our gratitude. Thank you.
If I may, Shola, I just omitted to thank you very much when I did my remarks. I believe you've been excellent today, and I hope that we can count on you at future events to lead us in the same way. Thank you very, very much, Shola.
I think that was entirely unnecessary, but I really do appreciate that gesture. Frankly, anything that I've done here, we've got an outstanding team behind us, by the way. Some of you may not be aware, but thank you to all the moderation team and the people behind the scenes, some dialing in from all the way from Colorado. Really appreciate it. And thank you very much. I hope we'll get a chance, I'm sure we will, Isabella, to have a bit of a debrief and a post-mortem, because there's so much rich stuff that I've learned over the past two and a half hours. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay well, go well, and we will see you again.